I have spent most of my life watching people misdiagnose the same disease under different names. They call it stimulus, they call it rescue, they call it liquidity, they call it support. What they almost never call it is what it really is. A transfer mechanism when the government decides it has painted itself into a debt corner and reaches for the money printer. The important question is not whether more dollars will appear. The dollars always appear. The important question is who gets them first, what they touch first, and what gets more expensive before the rest of the country ever sees the benefit. That is the difference between a policy that buys time and a policy that quietly strips purchasing power out of the hands of savers and wage earners. Most people hear the phrase money printing and imagine one of two cartoon versions. Either everybody gets richer at once or the whole system immediately explodes in a bonfire of hyperinflation. Real life is never that tidy. Real life works in sequence. Real life works through pipes, incentives, balance sheets, and timing. And if you do not understand the sequence, you will always be standing at the wrong end of it, wondering why your account balance looks larger while your life feels smaller. That is where I want to begin. Not with slogans, not with panic, with plumbing. Imagine I wave a wand tonight and every dollar in the country doubles by morning. Your checking account doubles. Your neighbor's checking account doubles. Every corporation's cash pile doubles. Every pension fund doubles. Every government account doubles on paper. Everyone is richer. In reality, no one is richer because the prices of assets, labor, goods, and services adjust to the same new arithmetic. The stock split version of prosperity is not prosperity. It is denomination theater. Now, imagine the opposite extreme. Imagine the government creates a mountain of new dollars and fires them to Mars. The money supply technically rises, but no family can spend it. No company can borrow it. No politician can route it. No contractor can invoice against it, and no speculator can lever it. The number is larger. The economy is unchanged. Those are the two clean extremes. And neither one is how the real world works. The real world works in distribution channels. New money enters somewhere. It enters through government spending, through banking expansion, through treasury issuance, through central bank purchases, through credit creation, through emergency programs, through favored sectors, through financial markets, through subsidies, through guarantees. It never lands evenly. It never arrives democratically. It arrives by route. And the route determines the winners long before the CPI print tells the public what happened. That is the point almost everyone misses. They think the danger is the printing. The deeper danger is the path. I learned a long time ago that when something in finance is called support, relief, or modernization, you ought to ask one impolite question before you do anything else. Support for whom? The federal government today is trying to solve a problem that politicians always postpone until arithmetic takes the microphone away from them. Debt relative to the economy is enormous. Fixed obligations are not shrinking. Interest costs are not polite anymore. The old luxury of pretending time itself will repair the balance sheet is gone. When a government owes more than the taxable economy can comfortably support, the menu is always shorter than the speeches. You can spend less, you can default, you can print, or you can try to engineer growth fast enough that the debt burden becomes less dangerous relative to a larger economy. That fourth option sounds respectable. It sounds like statesmanship. It sounds like the elegant answer that lets everyone keep their promises and their seats at the same time. But the fourth option only works if the new money and new credit are routed into real production rather than cosmetic activity. And that is where every debt era separates the adults from the salesmen. Austerity is the clean answer on paper, but democracies hate it because pain that is visible now always loses to pain that is diffused later. Default is even less likely because a reserve currency nation does not casually volunteer to destroy the trust embedded in its own bond market. So the system drifts, as it always drifts, towards some version of monetary expansion dressed in the language of prudence. That is what people mean when they say the money printer is firing up. The phrase is crude, but the instinct behind it is correct. The government does not have the political temperament for austerity. It does not have the institutional appetite for default. So it will search for a method that expands credit, suppresses financing stress, and buys nominal growth without immediately detonating the inflation psychology that scarred the last cycle. That last phrase matters, without immediately detonating inflation, because this time the goal is not merely to throw money into the room. The goal is to route it in a way that produces output before prices revolt. That is why this period is different from the last round in one important sense. The ambition is more selective. The authorities would like more credit creation, more treasury demand. lower financing pressure, and more private investment, but they would prefer it to travel through bank balance sheets and business lending rather than through the clumsy theater of obvious helicopter-style distribution. The hope is simple enough: if new credit finances production, then supply expands alongside demand. If supply expands enough, maybe you get nominal growth without another round of public fury over the cost of living. Maybe you inflate the debt burden more gently. Maybe you buy a few more years without repeating the ugliest features of 2021. That is the dream. Dreams in finance should always be stress, tested against incentives. Let's put it more plainly: a new dollar is not automatically inflationary. A new dollar that finances real productive capacity can be absorbed by a growing economy far more gracefully than a new dollar that finances consumption, speculation, or political patronage. If new credit funds a profitable factory, a productive data center, a working logistics network, an energy expansion, a useful technology, or a business that produces more output than the debt that created it, then the system gains a fighting chance. The future claim created by the debt is at least paired with some future capacity to satisfy it. But if the new money finances dead, end consumption, leverage games, asset churn, bailout theater, or the politically connected version of urgent necessity, then the economy inherits the liability without gaining the productive muscle required to carry it. That is when inflation stops being an accident and becomes a tax. Not a legislative tax, a sequencing tax. The people closest to the nozzle spend at old prices. The people farthest from it meet the new prices before the new money ever reaches them. I watched that lesson play out in the last cycle with almost embarrassing clarity. By the time the broad public finally felt flush, real assets were already repriced, financial assets had already levitated, and the cost of ordinary life had already started its upward crawl. The people who received the money earliest did not need lectures about inflation. They owned the things inflation reprices. First, everyone else got explanations. Now, if you want to understand why the current setup matters, you have to compare it to the favorite historical example people misuse. After the Second World War, the United States carried debt relative to output at levels that looked frightening, yet the country managed to deflate that burden over time without a clean, formal default. People look at that episode and tell themselves some version of the same comforting story. We handled it before. We will handle it again. That comparison flatters the present. What made the post-war adjustment possible was not merely financial engineering. It was the collapse of wartime spending and the redirection of enormous productive capacity into civilian output. The factories stopped serving destruction and started serving households. Men returned from war to work and build. The private economy regained room to breathe. The denominator grew. That is not the world in front of us now. Today, federal spending is not a temporary wartime mountain waiting to melt. It is a layered structure of entitlements, healthcare promises, interest expense, defense, and habit. The commitments are social and political before they are financial. They do not roll off a cliff because the emergency passed. Many of them rise precisely because the population is aging and the debt stock is large. In other words, the country no longer has the easy version of the post-war escape hatch. That is why the method matters so much. If you cannot slash spending, and you will not default, then you need nominal growth. If you want nominal growth without overt inflation panic, then you need more credit to flow into the economy. If you want more credit to flow into the economy, the banking system becomes the lever. And now we get to the part that sounds technical enough to make most people tune out just when the story becomes useful. Bank rules are not trivia, they are gates. There is a view inside policy circles that if the government wants lower treasury pressure and more private credit creation at the same time, it needs to make it easier for banks to absorb government debt and expand lending without choking on balance sheet constraints. That is where the conversation around leverage constraints and bank regulation becomes more than an academic footnote. It becomes monetary plumbing. If you loosen the relevant bottlenecks, banks can absorb more treasuries that helps the government finance itself more smoothly. The same loosening also gives banks more room to extend credit to businesses and the broader private sector. If that credit goes to productive use, you get investment, hiring, refinancing relief, and maybe enough output growth to dull the inflationary blade. That is the elegant version. The ugly version is just as plausible. Banks may take the freedom, buy the paper, chase the easiest returns, fund financial engineering, refinance the already favored, and send the new money through the top floors of the building instead of through the workshop downstairs. In that version, asset prices inflate, The government breathes easier for a while. The financial class calls it resilience. And ordinary households discover again that official success and lived prosperity are not the same event. This is what I mean when I say the money printer may be firing up again, but it is trying to fire through a narrower nozzle. Same force, different routing, that difference matters, but not in the way the average person thinks. Many people hear different this time and assume that means safe this time. I hear different this time and ask where the first wave will land, because that is the investment question, not whether the government is virtuous, not whether the language is updated, not whether the academics found a gentler acronym. Where does the first wave land if more liquidity and easier credit are coming? Then some things are almost certainly in better position than others. Cash is the obvious victim whenever monetary authorities try to soften a debt problem through expansion. Cash gives you comfort of count but not safety of command. It sits far from the nozzle. It waits for transmission. It absorbs the repricing after the people near the front have already made their decisions. Long duration promises also become dangerous in these environments. If your asset depends on the stable purchasing power of future dollars, while the system is leaning on policies that make future dollars less sacred, you are fighting the policy current instead of floating with it. By contrast, productive assets, scarce assets, and cash, generating assets close to the channels of credit creation tend to fare far better. A good business that can raise prices, refinance intelligently, and grow output is not the same thing as a static claim on future money. Real assets that survive inflation psychology better than savings accounts are not mysterious. They simply live nearer to the part of the economy policymakers are trying to keep alive. That is why I have always preferred ownership to hope. When the rules of the system are under stress, I do not want to stand in line as a passive claimant waiting for my purchasing power to be honored by courtesy. I want to own productive things. I want claims on output. I want businesses with margins, pricing power, and endurance. I want real assets whose value does not require every future dollar to remain as dignified as every past dollar. And I want to understand the difference between ownership and speculation. Those two words get confused constantly in periods like this. When people get nervous about debt, inflation, credit, and money creation, they often swing wildly between paralysis and gambling. They either freeze in cash because uncertainty feels intelligent, or they lunge at whatever noisy asset promises escape velocity. Both responses are emotional, neither response is disciplined. A disciplined response begins with this recognition. If the system is being pushed toward more credit creation and more nominal support, you want to be positioned where that nominal support is most likely to express itself, but you do not want to overpay for fantasy while doing it. That means I still care about quality, I still care about cash flow, I still care about leverage, I still care about durability. I still care about whether an asset depends on capital market generosity to survive or whether it can endure with its own economics. The easy mistake in a money expansion regime is to believe everything will float equally. It will not. There is a large difference between a real business and a story stock, between a productive asset and a decorative one, between durable cash generation and the hope of future financing. If easy money returns through the channels, policymakers now seem eager to open. Weak assets may bounce, but strong assets compound. That distinction is the whole game. The other thing worth understanding is that both plausible versions of the coming policy path are, in nominal terms, kinder to asset owners than to people whose entire balance sheet is wages, bank balances, and future promises. In the productive credit version, output expands, business conditions improve, financing pressure eases, and owners of productive assets participate in the growth. In the financialized version, the politically connected and financially adjacent absorb the first wave. Asset prices rise, and owners still do better than non-owners, even if the social outcome is uglier. That is not moral praise. It is structural observation. The system, as presently built, has made asset ownership the closest legal position to the nozzle. If you dislike that sentence, you are not arguing with me. You are arguing with the design. I sometimes hear people say that if another great easing cycle begins, they will wait in cash until things feel safer. That answer sounds prudent. It rarely is. What they mean is that they will accept certain loss of purchasing power in exchange for temporary emotional clarity. They call it waiting. In practice, it is often surrender in slow motion. You do not have to be fully invested at every moment to understand this. Liquidity has value. Optionality has value. A reserve is sensible, but there is a large difference between holding reserves for flexibility and making cash your philosophy in an era when the balance sheet of the state is implicitly asking to be diluted through growth, inflation, repression, or some blend of all three. The state may not say it that way, arithmetic does. The system is trying to avoid the deflationary death spiral that would come from refusing to expand. It is also trying to avoid the political consequences of obvious inflation, so it will seek the middle road of targeted credit expansion and regulatory adjustment, hoping that business lending and private production can carry enough of the burden to make the numbers look less frightening. Maybe it works better than the last attempt, maybe it only partly works, maybe it produces a better headline than lived reality, but none of those possibilities changes the central rule for the individual investor. Do not sit far from the nozzle with your wealth arranged as if purchasing power were a birthright. Arrange it as if policy is trying to save the system in nominal terms first and in real terms second, because that is what debt crises do. They expose the difference between nominal rescue and real prosperity. And once you see that distinction clearly, a lot of ordinary financial advice starts sounding like nursery rhymes for adults. Save more cash. Wait for certainty. Let the headline settle. Trust that the larger number in your account is the same thing as a stronger claim on the future. What matters is not the number of dollars you count. What matters is the share of productive reality you own when the state is forced to choose between discipline and dilution. The state almost always chooses dilution. Sometimes cleverly, sometimes crudely, sometimes through central banks, sometimes through regulation, sometimes through emergency language, sometimes through patriotic language. But the direction of travel is the same. And this is why I have always believed that the first job of capital is not excitement, it is self-defense. The second job is compounding. If you reverse those priorities, you get into trouble. You start calling speculation a hedge and leverage a strategy. You begin mistaking motion for protection. You begin reaching for whatever is loudest because the background has become uncomfortable. Real wealth is usually built in calmer ways than that. It is built by owning good assets through bad explanations. It is built by recognizing that when the government is cornered, it will preserve the arithmetic of the system in the way that least threatens its own continuity. That means more credit, more support, more incentives for banks to carry paper and lend, more tolerance for the nominal rise of asset prices than for the visible pain of contraction. You do not have to celebrate that. You do have to understand it. Because once you understand it, the practical question becomes personal. How close are you to the nozzle? Are you living entirely on wages and savings while assuming stability will protect you? Are you holding long promises that are vulnerable to a weaker future dollar? Are you overexposed to assets that need perfect capital market conditions? Or do you own productive assets, scarce assets, cash-generating businesses, and enough flexibility to act when fear offers quality at a discount? That is the final test here. Not whether you can predict the exact month some policy change is announced. Not whether you can name the acronym before it is fashionable. Not whether you can sound sophisticated in the comment section when the system chooses expansion over discipline. Will your wealth be positioned where the first benefits land, or will you once again be among the people, asked to understand the policy only after the prices have already moved? That is what this whole question comes down to. The printer may be warming up again. What matters is whether you are close enough to the line of fire to compound or far enough away to be quietly taxed by sequence.